Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us and for taking part in our conversation and webinar today. You're taking part in a conversation about translating science into solutions, confronting the impacts of environmental toxins on Black children and families. Of course, I want to give a special thanks to our President and CEO, Dr. Leah Austin, for her leadership at the national office here at the National Black Child Development Institute, for her extraordinary leadership and support throughout this planning process. And I also would just like to acknowledge all of you joining us today, near and far. I can see from looking at the chat that some of you are joining us whom I've known for just a little while, and some I've known through correspondence for many years. And I'm mindful of the variety of feelings and the variety of blessings which you bring to this moment, and I'm grateful to be with you. As you follow along, please be encouraged to use the chat functions. And of course, I would love if you would share your name and what state you are from. So welcome, my name is Dr. Lee Johnston III. I serve as Vice President of Policy for the National Black Child Development Institute, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's discussion for our Climate Week New York City event. At NBCDI, I lead our preeminent advocacy and thought leadership initiatives, our distinguished research and publications, and our equity advancing public policy and legislative agenda. What I am so excited to do today is to be in partnership with some incredible leaders to discuss those of you and many of you who work on behalf of and love Black children and their families. Who I have with me today for our discussion, starting from my left and going to my right, is Dr. Tanya Ked Taio. Dr. Taio is an epidemiologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Midwifery at Bastyr University. She also provides midwifery care on a part-time basis at CommuniCare Health Centers, a federally qualified health center with clinics in urban and rural communities around the Sacramento area. These clinics are committed to providing compassionate midwifery care to low-income families in a multidisciplinary setting. She is also a research fellow at the Birthplace Lab at the University of British Columbia. And at the Birthplace Lab, she's collaborating on the Giving Voice to Mothers study, a community-based participatory research project that examines how race, ethnicity, and birthplace affect maternity care in the United States. Additionally, Dr. Taio is concerned and conducts research on environmental exposures, which we will talk more about today, affecting pregnant women with a focus on neurodevelopmental outcomes and how maternal prenatal interact with environmental exposures. She also serves on the executive team of Project TENDR, which we will learn more about today, an alliance of more than 50 leading scientists, health professionals, and advocates working to protect children from toxic chemicals and pollutants that harm brain development. Project TENDR, as we will share more about, prioritizes ending the disproportionate exposures and impacts experienced by children of color and children and families with low income. Welcome, Dr. Taio. Thank you so much. Dr. Visa Lewis, who is our next panelist that is joining us today, is affectionately known as Dr. Visa, who is a best-selling author and serial entrepreneur. Her publications include children's books and music, motivational books for educators, and WINGS curriculum, a nationally recognized learning system for infants and young children up to age 5. Working as an educator and administrator for over 30 years, from preschools and Head Start to teacher education at the university level, Dr. Bisa is a diversely experienced education authority and renowned public speaker. And since 2018, she proudly serves as president of Black Child Development Institute, Atlanta. Welcome, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. So happy to be here to talk with you and Dr. Taio and the nation.
Glad that you could be with us. As is customary for any presentation that I'm a part of, I like to let people know what we're going to be discussing, what we're going to be talking about, and what the objectives are. So today's discussion is really simple. we're going to discuss the scientific evidence linking prenatal and early childhood exposure to toxic environmental chemicals to neurodevelopmental disorders. Second, we're going to talk about the effects on Black child development, the challenges of addressing race as a distinguishing variable in studies of environmental impact. And lastly, explore the urgency of translating research into national, state, and community level policies and practices that eliminate environmental threats to current and future generations of Black children. Now, as someone who has been working at NBCDI for quite some time, I'm really incredibly proud to represent NBCDI. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, I want to make sure that you are aware of the National Black Child Development Institute. And NBCDI is committed to being an ever-present and reliable force for keeping our beautiful Black babies at the center of our work and continuously strengthening our relationships, connections with you and all the professionals working to ensure our children have a strong start in life. Though in speaking at the center, when I think of our babies, I think of the preschool children they soon become, the teenagers they grow up to be, and the adults who walk among us navigating this wide, wondrous thing human existence is. And many of these adults are caregivers, much like the ones pictured on the slide with obvious delight. And others are the adults that make up the village that surround young people like all of you that are watching. So I want to give a special thank you for all of the work you all do that are watching, especially with all that is going on in the world. One thing that I want us to be clear about at NBCDI is our purpose, which is very simple: to mobilize communities and ignite movements on the strength of Black excellence, boldly advocating for equity and a just future for Black children and families. And our values are such that equity is seen as a process, justice as a goal, inclusion as a practice, and Afrofuturism as a vision. Afrofuturism embraces an infinite range of possibilities for Black people to live free and whole in a future of their design. And Afrofuturism says that not only will Black people be in the future, but we will design it. So what does this just and equitable future look like? This just and equitable future look like for Black children? Well, we acknowledge that Black children deserve to live in a world in which they are free to develop to their full potential, and that our world is at its best when we all collectively make every effort imaginable to sustain our society such that we experience the best Black children have to offer at all times. And at NBCDI, we are excited about the future we aspire to see created and welcome the challenge to free our world of injustices and inequities that keep us from our new reality. So what does a just and equitable future look like for Black children? Well, we're excited to dive deeper into that today. And one of those areas is that we would like and envision a world where every Black child breathes clean air and drinks clean water in a climate where they can thrive. So we are excited to start today's conversation right there. So as we start the conversation for today, certainly want to give you all some context, but certainly around Project TENDR, and one thing that as I was doing my research, Dr. Taio, in addition to understanding that Project TENDR, which stands for Targeting Environmental Neuro-Developmental Risk, is an alliance of 50+ leading scientists, health professionals, and advocates working to protect children from toxic chemicals and pollutants that harm brain development, and that you all prioritize to help end this disproportionate exposure. And I understand that this question that we have, given that BCDI Atlanta has been established since 1981 and has been involved in initiatives throughout the state of Georgia, and that there's been work via advocacy, action, and support to support Georgia's children, and that there are these engagement of interventions across family engagement, early care and education, and health. So I'm really excited to be talking with you, Dr. Biza, as we think about the future. But I want to first pose this question as I started in the presentation, and I want to start with you, Dr. Taio. What does an equitable and just environmental future for Black children and families look like?
I just love that you're starting off the conversation with dreaming, right? And and you know, what are we actually working towards? And I guess I can't even begin to address this question without addressing that it looks like a world where there's an end to systemic racism built into every part of governance, banking, education, and capitalism. The fight for environmental justice does not happen without addressing the root causes of inequity and the corporate forces that poison our communities without any accountability and extract wealth without any repair or reparations. So while I want to see Black communities cleaned up and polluting sources removed, I don't want to see them placed in other communities or rural areas where we can't see them. Even Reverend Dr. King recognized that he was an environmentalist, and he saw the interconnectedness of all of us on the planet. So in answer to your question, this is a place for me as a midwife where reproductive justice and environmental justice intersect. The definition of environmental justice, which is a term created by a group of Black women in Chicago who named themselves Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, rooted this new movement in the internationally accepted human rights framework created by the United Nations, and among other things calls for the human right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable neighborhoods.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I couldn't agree more. Sort of thinking about the ending of systemic racism and all of these areas and avenues that are deeply connected to our family life, that are connected to the safety of our community life, and also this place, and that you're speaking to around this interconnectedness of reproductive justice and environmental justice. And I will share with you, I participated even this week in a meeting with the Council on Black Health in partnership with a number of national organizations. And what became very clear is this emphasis on human rights. And I really appreciate you for really bringing that thread up, that oftentimes we think about civil rights or even have settled in some instances where some might argue for civil rights, but human rights really is what elevates it on an international stage and brings us together with other partners. But I would certainly follow back up with you, Dr. Bisa, you know, either in response, but also curious about what your thoughts are around what does an equitable and just environmental future for Black children and families look like to you?
Yes, I totally agree with all of the comments. And I would just add a realization of the American dream, and without constantly having to fight for what we deserve. As organizations, especially Black nonprofit organizations, we spend so much time fighting for what we deserve. And when different topics are on the table, such as environmental justice, and should there be a thing called environmental justice? Should that even be a term? Right? You would think that the health, the wellness, the nutrition, the education, the careers of everyone in our country, that it's important to everyone who's at these tables. But if that were true, we wouldn't need organizations like NBCI, BSATLAN, and our partners. We're happy to be here, but I'm sure you agree, Dr. Johnson, that when we rather focus on more positive issues and other issues in every single area, when you look at all the different measures in the Black community, and even at large in our country, whether you're talking about education, healthcare, any topic, why is it that our children are following at the bottom of those measures? The biggest problem with that, which is an equity issue, is when all of the organizations are writing for grants and funding for resources, creating policies even. Once those policies, those resources, that funding is realized, here's when equity becomes a problem. Those resources, they don't go where they're needed. What the same numbers that were written in those grants, qualitatively and quantitatively, that's where the resources should go. That's where the funding should go. That's where all of the collaborations and the policies that need to be created, though, that should be the focus that's written into these grants. But it's not happening, which is why we have to be at the table. So in order for us to have an equitable and just future in environment and any other topic that we're discussing when it comes to Black children and families, we need to have representation at the table. And when I say representation, I'm not just talking about people who look like us, people who have varying experiences. And that's really what's important. I think people have gotten too comfortable with having a Black face at the table and thinking they can check that box. It's more than just a physical person at the table. It's who's at the table and what information can they bring to support the implementation of the right policies when in programs in the community. And the biggest word I'll say is systems. We are being affected by these systems. And unfortunately, the systems are not being created with our children in mind or families.
Yeah, no, and I absolutely just plus one everything that you just shared about really the realization of the American dream. So this idea of having to fight for what we deserve versus just being. And even just being curious about the terminology that we're using now, that it would be non-existent if there was environmental justice already, if all things considered, if every one of us could go outside and be breathing clean air, and if our babies could be in places where there was clean water or there weren't any barriers to accessing clean water. And then also to your point about seeing the numbers written, the data, quantitative and qualitative. And I know as someone who understands evidence-based practice, but also practice-based evidence, you know quite well of the importance of attaching funds and grants to data. But even going a step further than that. And then to your point about representation at the table, it's not lost on me that, we have been challenged by thinking about diversity and only thinking about the people that look like us. And I understand that there is a benefit to being able to have those spaces that are carved out for the sort of like-mindedness of that and the nature of that. And I also understand, as you're pointing to, having varying experience. We often call it sort of having lived expertise and lived experience, so that there is that sort of physical connection, that personal connection that you can bring that support along, and that you can build champions, so that when it comes time to address the systems that you're speaking about on behalf of those that are being affected by them, that the connection makes sense, that it's relevant, that they understand. So I appreciate everything that you've named, which also makes it exciting for me to talk about this upcoming health disparities paper, Dr. Taio, that you have coming up. So I'm really excited to really dive a little bit deeper and have just some questions, sort of piggybacking off on what Dr. Bisa was saying, with having this sort of expertise inform these publications. But certainly when you think about the purpose of this conversation, really talking about the issues, because we have these systems that are either acting or not acting, yet have the data, what Dr. Bisa is talking about. And so there's this opportunity with this paper that is coming out. And what I think for the audience, what would be helpful is for you, given your background, your lived experience, your lived expertise, what are the effects of early exposure to toxins prenatally and after birth on the neurological development of young children? And sort of a follow-up to that, did you find any distinctions in the relationship between toxins and neurological development for young children. And I'll follow up with another question after that, but those are the first two that I would think. What are the effects of early exposure to toxins prenatally and after birth? And did you find any distinctions in the relationship between toxins and neurodevelopment for young Black children?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Johnson. The paper is coming out on the 27th, and in Environmental Health Perspectives, the one you referred to. It has been 4 years in the making, and I am one of several authors. And Project TENDR that you referred to, it came out of the Project TENDR Coalition. So to answer your question, I just want to dive in just to remind everybody, or to let people know, that the human brain is in constant development from just days after conception throughout the entire pregnancy. And a significant part of our brain architecture is really built throughout our infancy, and this brain development continues throughout adolescence. So this means that our brains are at risk for a very long time. So we reviewed 200 studies, and we included 7 neurotoxic chemicals. And many of the studies that we looked at found association with neurodevelopmental conditions that we've defined, like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. But also some of the studies actually examined school performance, cognition, and markers for learning, behavior, and also development using validated instruments. So our overall finding from this review of 5 decades of investigations that found that children from families with low incomes and families of color are exposed to more neurotoxic chemicals, and we experience greater harms. So this is a very important point that actually it took us about 2 years before we really realized what we were seeing, that there's the greater exposure, and then even for the same levels of exposure, we're seeing greater harms, to our children's brains. This, of course, is the first systematic review to examine both disparities in neurotoxic exposures and the disparities in the effects of these exposures, and utilizing race, ethnicity, and economic status. Most of the studies mentioned neurotoxic exposures by socio-demographic or socioeconomic factors, found these higher exposures. Lead, which there's 50 years of research that have told us lead is a neurotoxicant. Yet still, just about 5 minutes ago, I lived near a small airport, and I heard the plane going over, and those small planes still use leaded fuels. So right over an elementary school that's around the corner from me. And children in low income and non-white, predominantly non-white communities have higher exposures to air pollution. Black and Hispanic children were exposed to higher levels of organophosphate pesticides. That's one group of pesticides that's been highly studied. There are many other classes of pesticides that haven't been as well studied, so they were not included in our review. And non-white mothers had higher levels of phthalates. Phthalates are a neurotoxic chemical that is ubiquitous in our environment. We're all on computers, and the computer casings have phthalates. They're the things that make plasticizers. And then the studies that looked at the that when we looked at impacts, babies who whose mothers were pregnant in economically deprived neighborhoods in their first year of life and exposed to air pollution were more likely to be diagnosed with autism. Sorry, lots of examples in this paper. And I talked, we also really dug deep into the interactions where the impact of the chemical or the level of exposure to the chemical, and then you layered any sort of adversity, magnified the impact of that chemical. So there are biologic pathways that create that magnification of impact. We refer to that as interaction or effect modification. And so some of the studies did examine those interactions with race and neurotoxic exposures. Yeah, I could keep going, but I'm going to stop because I know you have other questions.
No. That's great. And so I actually appreciate you leaning into that question and sharing this. And I want to reemphasize this to the audience who is witnessing this moment, who is here listening to what you are sharing, because this is incredibly important, that this product of Project TENDR's work has been this review and analysis of more than 200 studies on neurotoxic exposure spanning 50 years, from 1974 to 2022, and the effects of these exposures on children's brain development. And so to reemphasize, as you shared, the name of this paper, this seminal health disparities paper on the findings of their Monumental review, will be published in Environmental Health Perspectives. And so to just reiterate what you've shared, just some high level points, that children of color and in families with low incomes are more exposed to neurotoxic chemicals and experience greater harm to brain development, learning, attention, and behavior. And that exposures are higher for children of color or low income children to all neurotoxic chemicals examined in the paper, including lead, air pollution, pesticides, and the phthalates.
Phthalates, yeah.
That's a word. Say that 10 times fast. Found in plastics, personal care products, even the plastics in our laptops. I want people to understand this. Scientists are failing to examine what we need to understand to protect children and communities, and instead use race as a proxy for adversity, stress, or discrimination, which you've shared here, adds another layer of adversity that magnifies the impact. Did I get it all, Dr. Taio?
Yeah, you did. That was good.
Awesome. Just want to make sure that I covered it, because everything that you just shared is absolutely critically important for people to understand. And so, given that, that's what we have as an understanding, I really want us to really think about sort of tapping into your diverse backgrounds. And so before I turn it to Dr. Bisa, I kind of want to sort of think about the evolution of this, because 200 studies for all of these years, that's a lot of data. That is a lot of information. So tapping into your diverse backgrounds and your years of experience in the environmental justice arena, what are the conditions that created higher levels of exposure for Black children to toxins in air and water? And more specifically, in your view, how has the conversation around clean air and water in relation to health disparities changed or evolved over the last 5 years? What is happening now? So I'll start with you, Dr. Taio, sort of thinking about what are the conditions that created it, but also how have the conversations changed or evolved, if any, over the last 5 years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We do have more research and a greater understanding that the impacts of clean water go and clean air go beyond cancers and autism and asthma, right? That was, that was a kind of collective understanding more than 5 years ago. We now know that cardiovascular health and brain health are impacted by air by these two. And for example, air pollution has been associated with preterm birth, which can be a driver of lifelong health, and particularly has an impact on the brain. But additionally, I do want to acknowledge that the advocacy of the environmental justice community has really driven the conversation in ways that ensure that more people are aware about these disparate exposures and impact. And also there's greater awareness about the ways that the climate changes that we've seen have and will continue to have an impact on both our water and our air. And as I mentioned, already we know that the air pollution studies found that children in predominantly non-white and low-income communities were more highly exposed. And we have seen many studies about water as well and this disparate exposure.
Thank you, Dr. Taio. And so I want to sort of tie that as a backdrop to how I reframe the question or frame it to you too, Dr. Bisa, to also hear from your perspective what you've seen. So as Dr. Taio has shared sort of from the advocacy community, sort of raising more awareness about the importance of climate, the impact that environment has on young children. So there has been sort of this greater awareness, and also thinking about how advocacy plays a role in creating an impact on raising that awareness to parents, raising that awareness to educators, but also recognizing the susceptibility that our children have in low-income communities and communities that are more forward-facing to exposures to pollution. So I would sort of say, with that understanding, with that nuance, tapping into your diverse background and your lived experience and lived expertise, what are the conditions that you would say have created higher levels of exposure for Black children to toxins in air and water? And have you noticed any evolution over the last 5 years around the conversation as it relates to clean air and water and health disparities? And has that changed?
Yes, first of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Taio and her colleagues, because we need this type of information to show that empirically, we need it to show that we're not making it up. We enter so many rooms where we find ourselves having to explain, and people think that it's just in our heads. Like, why are you all acting as if this is racial and it's not? Well, it's a problem in our communities, in Black communities, because we often get the low of the low, if you will. When it comes to food in our grocery stores, compare the produce to your other counterparts in other parts of the city, right? When you think about water, and we can name all the different they're natural disasters that happen because of climate change and what goes on in the environment, global warming, that supposedly doesn't exist, right? So when all of this happens, whatever it affects, whether it's food, the climate, the air, the water, oftentimes in our communities, we're getting the low quality foods. We're getting the low quality produce. And what has happened, it has multiplied our behavior concerns. And again, the study I'm just really excited about it. Traditional measures and methods that we teach at the university level to early educators, even those who are majoring in special education, the traditional measures, they're not as successful anymore. We need additional measures to support young children and families. And it's also, we all know that you can't just treat a cold, right? You got to treat its symptoms, right? You can't really treat a cold. It's really important that we treat this particular symptom. Because in our communities, if we're getting the lowest quality, our children are also performing where? At the lowest level. So it's behavior is a major problem. We know preschool suspensions and expulsions is a huge issue. We supported the writing of a bill through the support of NBCDI and some national partners about a year ago, and it was to support wraparound services for young children. And I'll never forget in the meeting with the Senate here in Georgia, the senator said, "You mean preschoolers are suspended and expelled from preschool?" Yeah, they are. And they're mostly Black children or Black boys. Head Starts and early Head Starts nationally, the goal of Head Start is to support children who have the different disparities. Most of the population, 90% of the Head Start population, the children who are accepted into Head Start, whether 0 to 2 early Head Start or 3 to 5 Head Start, they get those slots, not based on availability. It's based on the number of issues, challenges their families have had. The family service advocates literally sit at their office at a computer or even either virtually with a parent, asking them different questions. So if your father or someone in your family has been in jail or is not in your life, or mother, the highest level of adversities, that's who gets the slots. Those children get those slots. And the other 10% is usually reserved for their siblings who may have special needs. The reason why that's important is how challenging it is for us to win, if you will, when it comes to overcoming those adversities with our children. We can hire all the therapists, all the mental health consultants and support teams that we want, but look at how the odds are stacked against our children. So it requires more funding that we're continuously fighting to get, right? It requires more people in the room at different levels who support the policies and systems in improving. So I'll just stop there because your whole study, it proves what we needed to prove, but now we need the actions behind it, the systems of policies to change, to support better education, more people and professionals who can support showing how to interact with our children and their families to overcome these different adversities that have been caused by the environment, the food they're eating, the water, the air quality, all of those pieces are key.
No, I so appreciate everything that you shared, Dr. Bisa, and certainly thinking about why this kind of information is needed and necessary. I remember conducting a presentation not too long ago, actually on preschool suspensions. And so when you were naming that, I said, this is, it's when you look at the data that we have available, because as we know, the Office of Civil Rights went through a bit of a interesting experience during an administration change where there was a gap in data around preschool suspensions and expulsions, which meant that the most recent data that we have, we can accredit to much of the leadership within the U.S. Department of Education to make sure that we get this data. But when you think about Black preschool students accounting for 18, and I think this was data for 2017, 2018 specifically, that they account for 18.2% of the total preschool enrollment, but receive 43.3% of one or more out-of-school suspensions. And, thinking about that in relation to the backdrop of what you're naming here. So if we just look at, I just see behavior in the classroom, now you're out or now you're suspended, without actually thinking about the system that is disinvestment, that is at play, there's interplay of the toxic chemicals, then as you said, we're not just making this up. There is now data, but also there's this report that shows that as these effects are matriculating through our communities, what they do is they therein produce the challenges. And so I appreciate also your challenge to our university friends and academia to really think about, because their work is seminal in this movement as well in terms of advocacy, that the measures that we teach at the university level are just not as successful anymore. And this is actually an invitation for us to ask why. Why is that the case? And to get curious about the opportunity that exists before us around this. And so when I think about all of the things, and you actually took care of some of the questions that I was going to ask that you were noticing around what you've been seeing and how these sort of impacts of environment have been sort of showing up in classrooms. But also just thinking, and maybe this is just an opportunity to go a bit deeper here. One, Dr. Bisa, when you think about sort of the challenges with behavior, so we talk about challenging behavior. I've heard it my entire early childhood career, more than 15 years of hearing, this is challenging behavior, and the only solve for it is to remove the child from the classroom, right? But we know that that removal impacts learning time, it impacts socialization. So when you think about the implications for what happens to our babies in the absence of change, can you speak to what happens to our children if we aren't considering the symptoms, if we're not recognizing the connections systematically? What implications are there for our babies' development? One, and then what have been, as we all know, in the NBCDI village, but for our audience, I know that you've been deeply rooted in advocating for our babies for a very long time. And I know that, immediate change to the conditions that disproportionately harm Black children and families, even with the known negative effects, there's still sort of this talk about more research questions or more data that's needed, which I think is important. But I think what's also critically important is, one, naming what the implications are in the absence of change, but what have been some of the barriers to change that you haven't encountered in your advocacy and activism? So that's where I will point to you, Dr. Bisa.
Yes, so, this data is the qualitative part of it is really going to be important in our communities and the work that we do, because number one, it allows us to quickly show during the time that we have when we're talking to legislators or with different partners, we can quickly show that, hey, this is truly a thing and that we didn't make it up. That's number one. And then after that, we can look at what now moving forward, because we're so good in education and we're so good at telling teachers, especially what they can't do versus what they can. You can't suspend them, you can't expel children. Here's all the things you can do, but where's the list of what you can? And how can we allow that to happen? How can we support them in implementing that realistically in the classroom? Which is why all of these different partners need to come together. It's not just an education issue, because those same children, they go home. They go home to a family. And that family, based on their circumstances, they may or may not be able to support the development appropriately of their children as well. So maybe the child is not just acting out at school, they're acting out at home, but also the behaviors of the parents who are in their lives based on what they're eating or drinking, because of the environmental concerns, they have adverse effects in their own lives and don't even realize it. So bringing awareness to our communities, they may not know why they're acting the way they are. They may not know why they feel the way they feel. We often talk about high blood pressure, diabetes, the main illnesses in our communities, but we don't talk about how your environment affects you every day in your life. When you go make a cup of tea or coffee, is your water the same as the water of someone who makes it on the other side of town? When we tell you, oh, make green smoothies, and you go buy the produce at your farmer's market, if you have one, and you likely may not, grocery store, is it the same level of quality? So what we need to do is make sure at the university levels, and in addition to policy, this is the biggest piece here, we're not just focusing on programs, that we're focusing on the policy changes. Because with policies, when the legislators, when they put this in front of them and they make it a prime concern, then the funding follows. So at the university level, maybe there's a component in education where there's a class now on environment and education, or maybe there's increased courses on behavior. For instance, usually you get one course that relates to behavior, or just one chapter or unit. You get one course. If you get an early education degree at most universities, you get one, you take one course on exceptional children. In that one course, are you even discussing the effects of the environment? So we have to reform education. We need to make sure that we are considering all of these different side effects, but also symptoms that are affecting young children in their development as well as their families. And lastly, I'll say that the biggest piece that's important here is making sure that we're in all the rooms. Are we in all the rooms? Because they say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Make sure that we are showing up, not just to, giving out canned goods is great. We give out children's books that are coach responsive. All of that's really important, but don't get to the point where you forget what's most important. And sometimes we're kept busy in our programming that we forget what's important. What's important is being down at the Capitol and in legislative arenas. Lastly, I'll say that you asked about the children and making sure that we're coming together. The different organizations that you're working with, we have to make sure that we stand our ground. Stand our ground and make sure that when these discussions are happening, we're pressing pause and saying, well, wait a minute, that won't work in this particular community. Are we being considerate and equitable in all the different situations? So, those are just some pieces that I wanted to share, because this is a huge issue. And I don't think people understand why NBCDI in their field why is this important to them? Why is the environment important to them? Because it affects us the most. We need more scientists like Dr. Taio who are discussing this. So we need science taught early. And this is really the last thing I'll say on this so we can move forward. Science is not always taught, especially in elementary schools. They get a grade for it. But until children change classes, what I've noticed is science and social studies is often left off the table. So we need to make sure that, we are interesting our children, getting them interested in science early on. A lot of this is by design. It's by design. This question you're asking me, how can we improve and how does it affect us? It's by design that we don't move forward, that we don't improve, that we stay at the bottom of every measure. And we have to make sure that we're working together so that we can, as we always have, but improve what we're doing strategically, that we don't stay behind regardless of what the systems try to cause us to do.
Oh my goodness, you've given us many, many gems to think about, to ruminate on, because it is so important to think about the family, the child that the family goes home to after they leave school, the sort of ecological aspect of this, so the behaviors of the parent, the environment in which the parent and family live, the access that they actually have to the sort of resources that we say, as a public health person myself, saying, eat green vegetables if you don't have access to them, drink green juice, but if you don't have access to the fruits, or drinking water, even just from your own faucet, at the height of a crisis like Flint, that would be near impossible. So thinking about, as you shared, having these issues be a prime concern so that the funding follows in the policy space. And even appreciative of your invitation to think about reimagining early childhood education courses at the university level, thinking about how are our early childhood educators being made aware of not just the symptoms, but as you shared, the side effects. So if this child is, because I will tell you, I used to be an early childhood educator, and I can recall holding my infants, talking to my twos, and learning from my threes and fours. And you sort of assume that there must be something challenging in the home environment, but then your mind doesn't go to environment. It doesn't go to toxin. It doesn't go to lead. You know, these are things that, you know, that you're raising, that we as leaders in the early childhood space, but even more importantly, as we emphasize our commitment to a world where every Black child can breathe clean air and drink clean water, that we are making the case, or strengthening the case, because the case has already been made for decades, right? But strengthening the case and amplifying the case of why science is so important. And so I want to, you know, think about, you know, you shared so many tactics. So you've shared so much with us to really think about. And I'm curious too, from you, Dr. Taio, you know, as we move toward sort of solutions, as Dr. Bisa is raising for all of us who share this commitment to and love for Black children and families, what can we do as a community to actively prevent Black children and families from continuing to be harmed by environmental toxins? And in your experience, are there any strategies, big or small, individual or collective, that you would say can move us toward being toxin-free?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to say first that I could listen to Dr. Bisa all day. And I just, you know, I'm sorry that we have limited time. And, but yeah, there's a lot we can do. And I first want to speak to researchers and then policymakers very quickly. So anyone involved in science should really be studying how adversity and neurotoxic exposures interact to affect risk to children, right? And so one of the things that you reminded me about, Dr. Bisa, is many of the studies looked at the impact on working memory. Well, what does working memory look like in the classroom? So you tell a child, make sure you do this after you do this, right? Important instruction. If working memory has been impacted, that child has forgotten your instructions a couple of minutes later. And then that could easily be perceived as that child's not listening. That child's just being bad, right? And so the parents may have been the first ones that have experienced that and have put that stamp, you know, maybe the family, by the time they even get to any classroom. And so, so I appreciate so much your understanding about, you know, how of teachers and teacher training and really learn, you know, understanding how much of the work teachers have to do. So, but anyway, for the scientists, studying these interactions, intentionally measuring what you're really interested in, right? A lot of these papers had the assumption that that all Black people had the same level of risk, had the same level of adversity. So, and then use race as a kind of catch-all proxy term. So if you want to look at discrimination, measure discrimination. Design your study that you're going to ask people about their experience of discrimination. If you want to examine stress, measure stress, right? There are tools that are available to that. And undertake studies of Native American populations. They are specifically and systematically included, and very rarely were they included in the studies under that we looked at. So for the policymakers, and one of the objectives, Dr. Johnson, was you said explore the urgency of action. So just talking about what could be done this year. Well, in general, all levels of government should really act swiftly to prevent the use and emissions of neurotoxic chemicals and pollutants, right? What we can do this year is the EPA can adopt a much stricter air pollution standard that would be protective of children. They missed an opportunity earlier this year, and we need to demand that the EPA stops bending to corporations and adopts a standard that is really protective of children's brains. The FDA can immediately ban phthalates from food packaging and processing. Again, last year, or I think the year before, the FDA bent to the manufacturers and missed an opportunity. The EPA and the FDA can eliminate sources of lead pollution and lead exposure to children. I talked about the aviation gas in my neighborhood. And the metals, Dr. Bisa talked about food, and there's so many metals in the foods that children are eating. And we really actually just need the EPA to ban all organophosphate pesticides and then assess all the other classes of pesticides for further regulation. I hate to push the individual action, get your own water filter, but we need to do that. But we also need to recognize that we need to be working to protect our communities. So yes, if you can buy organic vegetables, that's wonderful. But are you advocating, for reduced use of pesticides, cleaning up the soil, and for all children? So I could go on, but I'll stop there so that I can hear Dr. Bisa talk again.
Yes, focus on the big picture. I think we get stuck in the small picture intentionally. We get stuck there, but we should focus on the big picture, and we should definitely make sure there's plenty of advocacy. And I just want to make this one big point. I noticed a comment in the chat and a question. I don't think anything needs to be created that's new. We don't need a new organization. We don't need another sector. We don't need another government. Or what we need is for the existing entities to work together and bring all the other entities to the table so that we can have talks and make sure that we are inclusive, that we are equitable where we need to be in all of the different areas that we're discussing. Because those stories that you hear and that research you hear is going to vary. We don't need another study. I shouldn't say that, but let's use Dr. Taio and her colleagues' study. But what happens is all the funding gets stuck in studies. Black people have been researched since we've been here, right? Forever, for centuries. We need the funding not to be spent on us surveying our people, but for us coming together as community organizations. Trust me, we know what our communities need. Bring us to the table, let us tell you, and let's work together to make it happen.
I'm just blown away by your feedback, your expertise, your leadership. I know that we are at the top of the hour, the tip top of the hour, and it has been an incredible privilege to be in this moment with both of you. And, I know that everything that you shared, I definitely want to make sure that we continue to lift up the recommendations that you've put forth, Dr. Taio, as well as you, Dr. Bisa. And I want us all to reflect on the part that we all see ourselves playing in making progress toward achieving a better future environment for Black children. As we discussed today, toxic chemicals in air and water, pollutants remain one of the most insidious threats to the health and well-being of Black children and families. And while we've acknowledged that these exposures are not safe, our response mechanisms remain in many instances inadequate. And therefore, these recommendations that have been lifted up are calls to action to continue to push for and pursue community engagement. whether that's advocating for your state and local health departments to act promptly on eliminating exposure to all neurotoxic chemicals as examined in Project TENDR's paper, to prioritize comprehensive lead testing, demanding that there is widespread and regular testing of water sources in homes and public spaces and neighborhoods to really identify and address potential threats, and to do this in combination of making sure that every child you know under the age of 6 is tested for lead, and establish transparent communication protocols, ensuring, as Dr. Bisa has shared with us, that elected officials prioritize addressing toxins and health departments communicate openly and proactively, because the politicians tell the health departments what to do with affected families. So parents should not just be made aware of potential threats. They deserve timely, comprehensive, and clear information that empowers them to protect their children. And supporting affected families with resources. As Dr. Bisa and Dr. Taio have waxed poetic, advocating for the provision of resources from local, from state, and federal establishments, such as clean water alternatives, lead abatement assistance, access to health checkups for children in affected areas, and then community leader engagement in decision-making. We have said again and again, and I will say once more, that we need to be at the tables. We need to recognize the invaluable insights and lived experience of those like Dr. Bisa, those like Dr. Taio, but also of those community leaders that you know should be at those tables. And we must insist on their involvement in shaping collaborative multi-agency responses to pollutants, but also acknowledging that their knowledge and proximity to the affected communities make them indispensable allies in crafting effective solutions. So we just want to say thank you to all of you all for joining us. I want to give a special thanks to you, Dr. Taio, and to you, Dr. Bisa, for being in this space and for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your grace, your brilliance with the audience to give us what our charge should be for all of those of us that work on behalf of and love Black children and families. Thank you all for joining us. I know that many of you have dropped contact information in the chat, and our wonderful research director, Kim Keating, is gathering that information. And so we will be sure to connect with all of you all, but please be on the lookout for this report. And again, just to emphasize that it will be published September 27th in the Environmental Health Perspective Journal. And please follow Dr. Bisa Lewis, who is the president of BCI Atlanta. They're all active on social media. So please be in touch with these community leaders, join in partnership with them as we all commit ourselves to a just and equitable future for Black children and families. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do, Dr. Johnson, as well, for our children.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Lots of love.